That day I woke up earlier than usual. The sun was just beginning to filter through the old curtains in the room, and everything seemed so fragile, as if the world were about to crack at any movement. I knew the conversation with my mother-in-law would be difficult, but I had no idea it would turn into a real tragedy for us. My husband was sitting by the window, smoking silently and looking as if he had already resigned himself to the verdict. His face was tired, his eyes red from lack of sleep. Our son was dozing on the nearby sofa, clutching his favorite teddy bear to his chest. I tried to smile so that when the boy woke up, he wouldn't see the anxiety on my face. But inside, everything was tight. My mother-in-law called us into her hall. She stood by the door like a stern judge and looked at us as if we had done her the greatest wrong in the world. Her lips were pursed, her arms crossed over her chest. There wasn't a hint of warmth in her gaze. The husband tried to start a conversation, saying in a low voice, "Mom, you know this won't last long. We're looking for options. I go every day. Be patient for a bit." But the mother-in-law cut him off sharply. "How much longer can we put up with this? You promised a month ago that you'd soon find a place to live. And I can see it now. You just sit here and put my shoes on for me." I felt a pang. I wanted to say something in response. To say that we were trying really hard, that my husband was exhausting himself looking for work, and that I was willing to take any part-time job as long as I had something to put on the table. But the words stuck in my throat. At such moments, I was always afraid of seeming ungrateful. After all, formally, she was helping us, giving us a roof over our heads. The son woke up and ran out into the hallway, pulling his grandmother's hand. "Grandma, can I stay here a little longer? I like it here." And these words sounded so innocent and pure that I expected my mother-in-law's heart to tremble. But instead, she took her hand away and said coldly, "No, honey, you have to live in your own house with your parents." I noticed my husband's cheek trembling. He clenched his fists. It was hard for him to hear, but he held it together. He walked over to his son, picked him up, and said quietly, "Let's pack our things." I walked into the room where our belongings were, a couple of bags of clothes, some books, toys. All of our belongings fit in a corner of the room. I packed everything in silence, feeling the tears burning my eyes. My son kept asking, "Mom, where are we going?" "Then we'll go back to Grandma's house." I stroked his head and said, "It'll be okay, honey. We're together, so we can handle it." When we went out into the hallway, my mother-in-law was standing by the door, as if waiting for us to leave. Her face remained impassive. She said tersely, "Live wherever you want, but not with me. I'm tired." I wanted to ask her, "Don't you miss your grandson? Don't you feel sorry for your son?" But she realized it was all useless. She closed her heart. My husband came over, looked at my mother for a long moment, and said quietly, "Thank you for taking us in, at least for a while." And he said it with such dignity that even I felt resentful of him. After all, he was trying not to stoop to reproaches, even though I knew he wanted to scream himself. The door slammed shut behind us with a bang. That slam seemed to separate us from the past and from hope. We stood on the landing with our suitcases and a child, not knowing where to go. It was cold outside, and the wind was blowing. My husband squeezed my hand tightly, as if trying to convey his last bit of strength to me. I looked at him, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see a confused little boy next to his mother. And the man who decided to fight to the bitter end. We went downstairs and out into the street. People were passing by, each with their own worries. No one cared about our problems. I felt how despair was trying to take over me completely, but I held back for my son's sake. He smiled, holding a toy in his hands and repeating, "Mom, everything will be okay, right?" I nodded and smiled through my tears. The three of us stood there, surrounded by an indifferent city. And at that moment, I realized we had no one left but each other. But that was precisely our strength. A month passed. At first, I thought all this time would drag on slowly and painfully, but the days seemed to merge into one. The small, damp room we settled into smelled of old wood and mold. The wallpaper was peeling. The ceiling in the corner had darkened with dampness, and every morning I heard cold water running through the pipes. But we were getting used to it. I made the bed with a clean sheet, put my son's toys on the shelf, and tried to create a cozy atmosphere. We were almost short of money. My husband went out every morning and returned late at night. Tired and exhausted. He visited companies, construction sites, warehouses, looking for work anywhere, but he was rejected everywhere. Somewhere they demanded experience, somewhere a correction, somewhere they said, "Call me back." I saw him losing strength, but I never heard him complain. Only sometimes, when he thought I didn't notice, he would sit on the edge of the bed, put his head in his hands, and sigh deeply. I tried to help in my own way. I took on odd jobs, did laundry for neighbors, scrubbed the hall floors, and sold children's clothes through an ad that my son had outgrown. Sometimes he managed a few cents, but even with that he was happy. We learned to live very frugally. For breakfast, simple porridge with water; for lunch, soup made from the cheapest vegetables. And dinner usually consisted of bread and tea, but I tried to serve it in such a way that my son wouldn't feel poor. Luckily, he was a child and found joy in the little things. He could spend hours drawing with pencils on old sheets of paper, building imaginary castles out of boxes, and inviting us to visit. Sometimes he would say, "Mom, look, this is our new house. It's lovely, warm, and there are always cakes." I smiled and played along, even though my heart ached. The neighbors sometimes looked at us with pity. Sometimes with curiosity. One woman said, "How well you're doing, you have parents. They'll help you." All young people live like this these days, sometimes with one, sometimes with another. I nodded, not telling the truth. After all, my mother-in-law hadn't called me this month. She never asked how her grandson was doing, if he was healthy, if we had enough food. At first, I expected to hear a call every night. I checked my phone, but then I stopped. Perhaps she really didn't care. Sometimes I caught myself feeling offended not only by myself, but also by my husband. After all, he is her only child. And now, when things are harder for him, she has distanced herself. At night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, going over in my head the day she kicked us out. The sound of the slamming door still echoed in my ears. But at the same time, during these trials, we grew closer. My husband, upon returning home, sat next to me and our son. We had dinner together, talked, made plans. Sometimes he told me stories from his childhood, about how he once lived in the same apartment with his mother, how she dreamed of leaving and building her own house. Her son listened with his mouth open and asked, "Will we also have our own house with dogs and a garden?" "Of course," my husband replied confidently. "I promise." These promises kept me going. Although we lived in poverty, there was hope at our side. One night, as I was gathering my son's clothes to put away what he no longer needed, my husband came in and said, "Looks like there will be an option soon. They promised to hire me as a loader in the warehouse for a while, but at least something." I saw that spark in her eyes that hadn't been there for a long time. We hugged, and in that moment I realized that, despite all the difficulties, we were stronger than we seemed. Another day passed, and then another. I was increasingly coming to terms with the idea that my mother-in-law had disappeared from our lives forever. But fate would have it otherwise. At night, while I was washing dishes in a basin, the phone rang. My husband picked it up, looked at the screen, and paled. "It's Mom," he said softly. We exchanged glances. I felt such a tightness in my chest that I could hardly breathe. After a month of silence, hearing her voice seemed unreal. My husband put it on speakerphone. "Son," his voice trembled and hurried. "I need help. I broke my leg. I can't even leave the house. No one's here, only you. Silence filled the room. I could only hear my heartbeat. My husband gripped the phone and looked at me. "What are we going to do?" he asked quietly. I silently dried my hands with a towel and went to the closet. A hurricane of resentment, anger, and pain raged inside me, but at the same time, I knew that leaving her alone meant losing myself. I took out my bag and started packing. We went to my mother-in-law's house at night. The drive seemed endless. The bus shook with every pothole. It was stifling in the cabin, and the child kept pulling at my hand, asking me where we were going. My husband was silent most of the way. He looked out the window, his lips pursed, and I understood that he was furious inside, with conflicting emotions. On one hand, there was the resentment he had carried for a whole month. On the other, the feeling of waiting so long for his mother. When we entered his house, it was already dark. The entrance was poorly lit. The light bulb in the ceiling flickered and crackled with the wind. I got up first and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, I heard the sound of a crutch on the floor and labored breathing. The door opened. My mother-in-law stood before us. She wasn't the strict woman who had kicked us out a month ago. Her hair was disheveled, her face drawn, and her eyes tired. She wore a tight cast on her leg and was holding onto the doorframe, trying not to lose her balance. "Come in," she said softly, and her voice didn't have the harshness we were used to. We entered the apartment and immediately smelled the stale air. In the kitchen, there were unwashed dishes in the sink, empty cups on the table. The room smelled of medicine. Everything seemed as if life in that apartment had stopped. I helped my mother-in-law to the sofa, sat her down gently, and arranged the pillows. She looked helpless and confused, and at that moment I felt sorry for her as a human being. Despite from the offense, my husband asked curtly, "Why didn't you call someone before?" She looked down and whispered, "I thought I could handle this on my own. The neighbor helped me the first few days, but she had her own things to do, and then she realized she couldn't do it alone." I went to the kitchen to distract myself. I opened the refrigerator. There was almost nothing in it. A bottle of water, a piece of dry cheese, and a bag of expired milk. I felt an unpleasant lump in my throat. Silently, I took the food I had taken from our bag and started making soup. Meanwhile, my son was sitting next to his grandmother, drawing something. She handed him a piece of paper with a house and trees and said, "Grandma, this is for you. We all live together here, and no one kicks anyone out." I froze at these words. They sounded too direct, as if God himself was speaking through the child. My mother-in-law took the drawing with trembling hands, and tears filled her eyes. She pressed the paper to her chest and whispered, "Forgive me, grandson." I came out of the kitchen with a bowl of soup and placed it in front of my mother-in-law. She looked at me as if she couldn't believe I was willing to take care of her after everything she'd been through. She was silent for a few seconds, then said, "I'm sorry, too." Her voice trembled. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I wanted you to learn to cope on your own. But it turned out this way." I sat in a chair and looked at her. Everything was fighting inside me, pride, resentment, anger, but at the same time compassion. After all, she was my husband's mother, my son's grandmother. I realized that if I walked away from her now, she would be as cold to us as she was. My husband was silent for a long time, then sat down beside me and said, "Mom, we wouldn't hold a grudge if you had at least called once to ask how we were. I'm your son." She looked at him with pain in her eyes. She was afraid that you wouldn't forgive her. Afraid of appearing weak. At that moment, I understood. Behind all her toughness, there had always been fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting that she, too, could be wrong. Suddenly, the son hugged his grandmother around the neck and said, "Grandma, I love you." These words shattered the wall she had been building for so long. My mother-in-law burst into tears. Deep tears that seemed purifying. The three of us sat together, and I felt the tension between us slowly dissolve. I didn't know if we would ever be able to completely forget everything, but at that moment, I definitely understood that there was a place for us in her heart. The next few days, we spent almost all our time at my mother-in-law's house. My husband left in the mornings for a temporary job, and I stayed to help. At first, everything was unusual. I cleaned, cooked, carried the groceries, and made sure they took their medications on time. Sometimes I caught my mother-in-law's cautious glance, as if she couldn't believe I was doing it without reproach. But little by little, the tension began to disappear. One day I was cooking in the kitchen, and my mother-in-law was sitting in a chair by the window, leaning on a crutch. She kept silent for a long time and then said in a low voice, "I thought I was doing the best thing for you when I kicked you out. I wanted you to recover, so you wouldn't get used to an easy life, but apparently that wasn't the case." I turned to her and answered calmly. "You could have said it with words, we would have understood everything. But you chose the more difficult path." She sighed and lowered her gaze. There was so much tiredness and regret on her face that I could no longer be angry. My son seemed oblivious to the old grievances. For him, his grandmother was still his grandmother. She happily brought him toys, drew new pictures, and asked him to read a story together. Sometimes I noticed my mother-in-law smiling furtively when she looked at him, and something sweet, long forgotten, appeared in her eyes. My husband also began to change. When he returned in the evening, he sat next to my mother, helped arrange the pillows, and brought tea. Conversations between them began again, not dry or harsh, but lively. They reminisced about their childhoods, and shared some funny anecdotes. I listened and understood. This month of separation. More than insults, it turned out to be difficult, but perhaps that was precisely what they needed to truly understand the value they had for each other. One evening, my mother-in-law unexpectedly said to me, "Thank you for coming. I know, I don't deserve it." I smiled and replied, "We are a family, and family is not only joy, but also difficult times. The important thing is that we're together." Those words seemed to end our fight. Not in the sense that everything was forgotten. No, grievances aren't erased so easily. But now we had a chance to start over, understanding that cruel words and pride can destroy closeness. And kindness and support can restore it. A few more weeks passed. My husband managed to secure a new job, and we began saving money for housing again. But even when we returned to our rented room, my mother-in-law still called almost every day, asking about her grandson, interested in our affairs. Now her voice sounded different, softer, warmer than before. I often caught myself thinking, maybe it was meant to be this way. Sometimes people realize their mistakes only through suffering. And perhaps it was this difficult path that helped us all grow closer. We didn't become an ideal family. We still had our differences and wounds. But that cold wall separating us no longer existed. And that was the most important thing. We hadn't become an ideal family. We still had our differences, but the cold wall separating us was gone. My mother-in-law called almost daily, asked about her grandson, and took an interest in our affairs. Her voice sounded softer, warmer, and no longer had that harshness that had once hurt us so much. My husband found a foothold at work. We started saving for housing again. And now it was easier to live in a rented room, because there was support nearby. I understood that the difficulties hadn't been in vain. Sometimes you only realize your mistakes through pain, but it's pain that teaches us to appreciate what's truly important. And now we had a family that wasn't ideal, but real, in which there was room for forgiveness and love.